Welcome everyone to tonight's webinar, Psychedelic Cults, Narcissistic Leadership and the Whistleblower Phenomena. My name is Dr Lani Roy and I'll give a big introduction to myself and Signs of Life in a moment. But before we begin, I would really like to drop into this space together and open up the container for us tonight. So if you'd like to take a moment to shake off the day and arrive here together by acknowledging country, the elders, past, present, and yet to come. And just really connecting into this incredible space in Australia that we have, the wisdom and the lineage and traditions here in Australia. And as these medicines, these powerful, powerful medicines come to Australia and into our clinics and research centres, our not-for-profits, may we really, look at the safety and the reverence of these sacred medicines in the mental health setting and really move forward, integrating the science and the sacred and really being, in reciprocity and irony with these medicines and our community. So tonight, I just want to acknowledge anyone in the room that has been impacted by narcissistic abuse and cults and the whistleblower phenomena. You may have experienced this in your family of origin, in your interpersonal relationship or your workplace, or even just acknowledging the elements of narcissism that exist in our culture, in capitalism, mainstream media, and what it is to be alive at this time in our culture. And really just looking after yourself tonight. This webinar might bring up some personal things for you, just letting you know that Signs of Life, is available to talk afterwards if you need to. Our information will be sent out and other resources to let you know who you can access support with, which is really important. And, I also want to acknowledge there might be people in this space tonight that are listening because they've been asked to, maybe by a boss or by someone in the community, and just really reflecting on your own practices in this space, your leadership, how you're running your organizations, how you're treating people. And know that, I'm personally committed for the rest of my life to educating people on the red flags and the risks of narcissistic abuse and in leadership and psychedelic cults, because it is a pretty dark and insidious power that has been here since, we'll go through a bit of history. These are not new concepts, but this is a rapidly emergent field in Australia. And I'm very passionate about educating people in this space. And I also want to just acknowledge that we're going to hold the vibration of compassion tonight and not lower it to any, defamation or slander or, we really want to keep this vibration of professionalism and personally, someone who's come face to face with some pretty dark behaviours in this world, even, evil for a better of a word, I like to keep in mind that, once upon a time, we were all babies. We were all children born into this profound, profound mystery. And somehow along the way, people have become very lost and, have then, engaged in, pretty horrific crimes and abuse. And so holding that compassion, but also holding education, risk assessment and strength, because what I've learned from this field is when you have the power to speak out and speak to others and educate and protect, we can collect. So I guess just, wrapping that space up is they encourage people to tonight during the Q&A not to name any organisations. I know that's really challenging and tempting and also unfair, because we should be able to speak freely as professionals and community members. But the reality is there's really litigious people out there, and they could be watching, and they might watch this webinar after. So please, if you want to have private chats, we can find spaces to do that, and we really encourage private dialogue. But tonight, just no names of people or organisations. And yeah, just keeping in mind that we want you to critically reflect, even if the word cult or narcissistic leadership doesn't resonate with you. Please inquire about the groups that you're involved in, their ethics, whether it's religious, spiritual, philosophical, social, corporate, or otherwise. We really want to start instilling this critical lens of how these organisations are operating. And one more thing is, I'm really passionate also about not overusing the word narcissism. I think that word can be thrown around quite loosely, particularly in the psychedelic field. If people are passionate, or they're hardworking, or they're in social media a lot, we really need to be mindful that a lot of us have narcissistic parts. That's part of the psyche. That's part of the archetypal structure of our systems to some degree. And using that word, really, thinking about it before we use it, and really being mindful of people's reputations, because there's many people that aren't narcissistic that get labelled that as well. So I just want to hold that in mind. So tonight we will cover what is a cult, what does the literature say about the key characteristics, what type of cults are there, and are they all religious? What do they look like? What's the difference between a cult and a group? The types of people that join cults and keep them there, and we'll unpack some of the blinders and red flags and things that occur, because many smart, talented, educated people get involved in cults. So we really want to debunk some of that stigma and shame as well. It can happen really quickly for people, and yeah, we will provide education around how to risk assess and become more empowered to know what you're dealing with. Also looking at the means of control, the power and influence used by cult leaders. What does psychedelics have to do with cults, and what is the risks and themes we're seeing there? How can you support someone or yourself if you've been, if you're in a cult or planning to leave? It can be very isolating and very confusing for cult members, and we really are committed to providing tools and resources to help people navigate those spaces. Yeah, and what is whistleblower phenomena? What does it look like, feel like? What are the potential repercussions, and how can I protect myself? Would you Violet?
Thanks, Lani. Just a little bit of a quick introduction to me. My name's Violet Cordwell. I am a research assistant and project officer at the Science of Life Psychology. And I also work as a policy officer in the field of institutional child sexual abuse. And I've worked there for almost 4 years now. So definitely have had lots of experience working with institutions, none of which I intend on naming tonight. Also just wanted a little disclaimer that I'm certainly not representing any particular organisation, and anything that's sort of spoken about tonight is purely sort of academic from my lens, and isn't representative of another role. I have to give that disclaimer in the interest of not being in a conflict of interest in any of my roles at all. And I won't speak to specific examples of institutions because of that as well tonight. So if you ask me a question directly, I might hand over to one of the presenters if they'd like to speak to that and answer to that. But I won't be doing that myself tonight. I'll purely be coming from the academic perspective. And without further ado, I'd like to, sorry, Lani.
Now that, because you've done your intro, we might just do our intros now before you.
Yeah, go for it.
So some of you may know me already, but I'm the director and founder of the Science of Life Psychology, which really began many years ago now, 12 years ago, because of my work in the field of sexual abuse and human trafficking, and working with with people in the sex industry as well, but a real big passion that was born from my work at Canberra Rape Crisis Centre and working with ritual abuse and cult survivors. I was very young. I was in my 20s when I began this work, and it was pivotal in my my clinical work around how to hold, that level of trauma and complexity in the world. And so I opened my private practice and have been working in that field ever since in various ways. And then due to my own spiritual emergence and connection with ayahuasca and the Vegetalista lineage, began, working in the field of psychedelics and psychedelic therapy. I'm involved in clinical trials and consultations and cannabis-assisted psychotherapy and ketamine as well. But I guess I entered this field with specific blinders myself, because I just came off the tail end of a spiritual emergence and had just rediscovered these medicines, and was really quite naive given my level of education. 13 years of uni, traveled the world extensively, worked in cults, a lot of life experience. Quite alarming how much blinders I had on myself entering this field, and the lessons that I learned over the last couple of years here in Australia and overseas has really, it's been quite harrowing, and it's challenging and painful, and also exquisite, the community and places that I've landed. But I just wanted to put that out there that, the rest of my career will be really supporting psychedelic therapists and the community to help integrate those lessons and to educate people on blind spots, because we all have them, and shaming people doesn't help that. Educating, risk assessment, having this knowledge is what's going to help us get through those blind spots as we go through practice. So yeah, it's wonderful to be here tonight, and it's a real privilege to work with Violet and Kayla, really strong people, and I feel your body of work and your the edges that you have in your work, and just want to say thank you. And Kayla, over to you.
Thanks so much, Lani. I have some similar experiences and background to Lani and Violet. I worked for a number of years in sexual assault crisis intervention, as well as domestic and family violence, and supporting survivors of institutional child sexual abuse. And I certainly really, through my work in that field, picked up and became extremely aware of the patterns of power and control that are replicated across power structures in every conceivable organization. And I personally had my own experience in growing up in a high control religious organization that is and can be labeled as a cult. From my personal experience and my work experience, I moved on and started to do my PhD at the University of Sydney last year. And my research really focuses on the theoretical, philosophical, and epistemological underpinnings of modern psychedelic and MDMA-assisted therapy. And I've written a review on touch in the modern clinical and naturalistic research on psychedelics and MDMA for the treatment of mental health conditions, and how touch and different approaches to touch really highlight the differences in the theoretical underpinnings of this therapy. And I also do work around ethics and informed consent in that space. And I am also a part of the Students for Sensible Drug Policy Research Circle. So I've been diving pretty deep into the recent TGA decision and the rescheduling decision that I'll talk about a little later, and some of the history of Australia's previous era of psychedelic assisted therapy. So that is my background. Thanks for having me here today.
Cool. Over to you, Violet.
Thanks, Lani. So I might just start us off with this quote, and I'm going to read it out loud because I think it's really powerful when you hear it out loud. Virtually everyone leaves utopia after a time. The quick and hardy do not necessarily defect early, nor is it always the witless who linger on. One leaves when he has gained what he came for, when his commitment is exhausted, when it is no longer necessary to sort through the breviary of questions that concern his freedom. If that quote confuses you and you have no idea what that has to do with cults, I hope that by the end of this presentation, that will become clearer to you, and why perhaps belonging to a cult, belonging to a group, a high demand group, a high needs group, why perhaps that would be considered utopia for some people for some time while they're in it. And perhaps also trying to reflect on the utility that that group has had for people at one point in their life, and the importance that that group had for them as well. In addition to considering the dangers of the group, I think it's important to reflect on the utility that they've had for people to hold compassion and understanding for them as well. Thanks, Lani. Impeccable timing. So what is a cult? It has no single definition. It is a highly, highly contested term. It's a highly contested term in the literature. It has many, many names, sometimes referred to in terms of its religious orientation, often referred to in terms of its religious orientation, actually. But needless to say, cults are certainly not just religious groups by any means at all. They don't even necessarily have to follow a doctrine, a scripture, a sacred text of some sort, although religious groups generally do. But I really like this quote here by Pignotti, which states, cults are best defined in terms of their deeds rather than their creeds. And what's important about this quote is when we're talking about their deeds, we're talking about their behavior. We're talking about mechanisms of control. We're talking about exploitation. We're talking about abuse. We're talking about manipulation of people. And we're also talking about, again, the utility that they're bringing for people. So what is making these groups so attractive? What's so interesting about them? There's a purpose that they're serving here for people. That's what's attracting people there. I think it's a bit of a myth that the only people that join cults are people who are in real distress, people who are in crises. Sometimes it's more a process of seeking purpose, seeking meaning, seeking belonging, seeking connection. So for our purposes today, we're certainly not defining cults merely as religious. We are definitely thinking of them in terms of their patterns of control, their suppression of individuality, and I guess their process of de-individuation. So really looking at the connection, the social connectedness that comes from these groups, and how over time, I guess, the individual sort of ceases to exist to some extent. They're definitely still there, but they're silenced. They grow smaller, perhaps they're locked away a little bit more internally, and instead of the individual having this voice, this autonomy, it starts to become replaced with, I guess, the group's voice. And it can be really hard to differentiate at that time between your voice and the group's voice. Perhaps they're starting to sound like one. Perhaps you can't tell the difference. And cults definitely require high demands of the people that are in them, hence why they're sometimes referred to as high demand groups. So they require obedience to the norms, to the values, to the beliefs, and sometimes towards a cause that's always put forward by the cult leader. And something that's, I guess, not necessarily unique to groups, but certainly important when thinking about cults is that there is always a singular group leader. There might be other people in positions of power, but there's generally someone pulling the strings here. There's someone that is leading the group, putting forward the norms, putting forward the beliefs, and also sometimes putting other people in positions of power where they can further sort of enact that control, I guess. through manipulation, through abuse, through coercion, through exploitation. So there's definitely a degree of conformity that is required. And I guess what sets cults apart from other groups is that it's not really a kind of, you can be a third in or you can be kind of 25% in. You have to really sort of have both feet in. And I guess that's really the process of that groupthink that comes in. You as an individual starts to become a little bit more silenced. Your subjective experiences start to become sometimes distant from you as well. And just want to put a note down here in terms of, I guess, powerful subjective experiences such as altered states of consciousness. And Kayla will speak to this a little bit later. But cults can sometimes have or include powerful subjective experiences. And that might be through things like meditation, it might be through things like ritual, through things like psychedelics. And it's all about creating activities and time where people can come together and have this shared experience. So just like how people have shared experiences in a church, and there's sort of a term for it called collective effervescence. When you think of yourself, if you've ever gone to a concert and you feel that like enigmatic energy of all the people singing this song together, and you feel that kind of vibration, and it's very intoxicating. That's kind of the idea behind these powerful subjective experiences. It's like this feeling of oneness where all these people are coming together and believing in something wholeheartedly, putting their whole self into something. And I guess that kind of lends towards the attractiveness of it as well, this feeling of social cohesion, this sense of purpose, this meaning, this belonging. And just looking at our honeycomb to the right here, you can see that, as Lani mentioned earlier, can be all kinds of things. It can be sporting groups, it can be orphanages, it can be corporate entities. And again, just reflecting more so on how is control enacted, and not even necessarily who has power, but who is exercising power and how. Because it could be argued that everyone has power, whether they realize it or not, but it's perhaps how it's being executed. That's important, I think, when we're looking at cult dynamics, and what kind of coercion and manipulation and exploitation are involved in that. You can move on, Lani. Okay, some cult characteristics here. So I mentioned earlier, it's a little bit hard to be 25% into a cult. Generally requires unwavering faith. And that's something that's really directed by the cult leader themselves. They're requesting unwavering faith into the group, perhaps into its cause. And it often involves behavior or intentions that aren't really displayed honestly or openly. They can be presenting one thing, perhaps presenting as a group that, again, has some kind of utility for you. They can bring you something. Perhaps it's a group of people to connect with socially. Perhaps it's a group of people to believe in a cause with, whether it's a social cause or some other kind of cause. And something interesting about cults is that people within the group strongly defend it. And that's generally a requirement, is that you strongly defend the identity of the group, the values of the group, and any cause that it represents. And anyone who disagrees with the cause or the values or the identity is often seen as a problem. So people outside the group can be perceived as dangerous. They can be perceived as capable of undermining the group in some way. And people within the group are generally asked to defend that in some shape or form. And that might even be just being asked to be isolated from those people. So creating that us versus them mentality. Again, this is a key characteristic between cultic behavior versus group behavior. Both have forms of social cohesion, social connectedness. However, in a group, and arguably some even have probably to a lower level, the us versus them mentality. It's okay and very normal to have differences with people within and then external to a group. But when it becomes an issue of it's us against them, and people outside of the group are looked as dangerous, or that they can undermine the group in some way, that's when it starts to become a little bit more of a problem. So people within the group can be encouraged to stay away from outsiders. Sometimes they can be forbidden from having relationships or friendships if the people don't belong to the group. And there's a large sense of keep everything internal. Keep all of the issues within the cult internal, keep all of the relationships internal. It really can become all-consuming. And that's why you have those mechanisms of control on the right there. It can become a matter of physical control. It can become a matter of psychological, economical, social, spiritual, and it can vary. So in terms of psychological, something that cults have in common with perhaps the family violence sector and domestic violence is the element of coercive control. Okay, so coercive control it's a range of tactics, but it's basically a very covert, normally form of control, and it's extremely confusing for people. It's essentially where, in this case for cults, the cult leader is extremely manipulative, and they seek to kind of shame, belittle, or otherwise, I guess, manipulate the person. And they do that through gaslighting, which is basically making someone question their reality. And they create tests of loyalty for the people in the group. So they'll do things like kind of through, I guess, reward and punishment system. They might give excessive attention and affection to people who are seen as doing the right thing, the people who are really living by the norms and the values of the cult. And then when people don't do that, or people express any kind of doubt, they might withhold that attention, withhold that affection. And so for people who have gotten used to that kind of connection, especially if you haven't had it before or you've really struggled with it in your life, and then you come along to this group and it's, geez, like everyone's really supporting each other, everyone's really connected to each other, and this group leader seems to have such a strong interest in you. They seem to put a lot of faith in you. They seem to trust you, and they share things with you, and they make you feel special. And then if you do something that that group leader doesn't agree with, that's often withdrawn suddenly, coldly, and you might have just done something that the leader has just disapproved of. And the idea is basically to create that unwavering faith and remove self-doubt, and remove doubt that comes from the group as well. So it seeks to sort of limit that individual voice, that voice that says something's not right here, this doesn't feel right. And the group leader is really instrumental in that. And they often encourage other members of the group to spy on one another, and for lack of a better term, to snitch on one another and say, you know, so-and-so has said this, so-and-so is doing this. So the other members of the group then become involved in the control. They're all kind of spying on one another, telling on one another. And that kind of keeps, again, that social connection. It makes it extremely strong. But if anyone is to speak out and have that kind of individual voice and act autonomously from the group, that can become a really big problem. Other forms of control include economical. So you might have some groups that seek to control how people spend their money, where members live. They may even be asked to provide money or assets to the cult, and that might be done very often under the guise of forwarding the social cause of the group, or perhaps a spiritual or philosophical cause of the group. So if you donate this money, if you provide this asset, this building, then we'll be able to do X, Y, Z. And that can kind of, I guess, provide a lot of purpose for people as well, a lot of meaning for people, that you're personally forwarding the cause of the group and you're really instrumental in that. It also might be physical control. So a trigger warning here, it might be physical and sexual abuse. And that can be used as a method to instill fear, loyalty, to confuse, or just altogether to just diminish someone's self-worth and increase their dependence on the cult. Another key element of cults is this idea of dependence. When we talk about de-individuation and silencing the voice of the individual, we're talking about the leader of the group wants you to be dependent. They want you to not have resources outside the group. They want you to not have relationships outside the group, because if you can control all those other factors, you're easier to control as an individual. The idea is to isolate you through fear tactics, to make you feel like everything that's of value in your life is coming from that group. All your social connection, perhaps all your education has even come from the cult if you were someone that was born into the group. And you might be thinking, well, how do I get a job? Perhaps you didn't have education outside of the cult. Perhaps that was completely within it. And so it can start to become extremely isolating, especially for people who were raised in a cult, or whose family members and friends are within the cult. And in order for them to leave, there's those repercussions. There's, am I going to lose my family? Am I going to lose my friends? Who do I know on the outside? Who's going to support me? Do I have a job? Do I have any transferable skills? Do I have any transferable education? These are all barriers to people leaving these groups. And I guess barriers to them seeking external sort of ways of being and knowing outside of that group as well. And last but not least by any means, spiritual control. This is a really interesting one. It can be very dynamic, very diverse depending on the group, but it can look like a few things. It can be things like being excluded from entering a transcendent state. It can be things like excluding people from rituals. It can even be the threat of Armageddon coming to Earth, or some kind of eternal damnation. And so it might be a matter of, if you don't sort of belong to this group and you don't believe in this faith or this doctrine, then bad things will happen. Bad things will happen to humankind, or will happen to you. And so there's this sense of existential threat as well. And that's not present in every cult group, but it certainly is in many. And spiritual control can be religious, but also just want to outline, it also doesn't have to be religious. The people don't have to follow a specific doctrine or a text. It can also be other kind of groups as well. But those that do follow a certain doctrine or text and who involve spiritual control, they often take it with extreme literality, and there's a degree of fundamentalism to the group. And so that doctrine is taken extremely seriously. I might pause there and just see if Kayla or Lani want to add anything to those slides.
Yeah, you're doing, brilliant, Violet. Just wanted to add that typically when the cult leader or the narcissistic leader is building you up, simultaneously they're also looking for weak spots and ammunition that can be used against you. So a lot of people get trapped in that. We'll speak to the complexities of leaving a cult later, but the part of the building up process is also them looking for ways in which they can ammunition to keep you harmed, keep you silenced, and they tend to be very clever typically at looking for those vulnerabilities, blind spots, complexities that can keep you paralyzed in their control. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Did you want to add anything, Kayla? Oh, good.
Just as you're describing all the characteristics, it becomes so salient how much of a parallel this has with intimate partner violence and the patterns of control that exist in that micro dynamic between two people. And I think And certainly that's something that I saw unfold in my own upbringing in a cult, is how that macro level cult dynamics and all of these things described also filter down into the dynamics between the people in the family who are in that cult, and how all of these different elements become present. The other thing I was thinking, for some people who are on TikTok these days, we've all heard of red flags, but I've started hearing a lot about beige flags coming up. And some of these characteristics can be beige flags. And what we mean by beige flags is things that can be neutral. And so unwavering faith is one of these components of religion that is oftentimes seen as positive, and in a relationship, we'd see, you know, devotion, dedication to the relationship being a positive thing. So it can make it very difficult to see the difference between an alarming or potentially harmful scenario as opposed to one that is neutral and innocuous. I'll let you continue, Violet.
I was going to add to that, Kayla. Thanks for mentioning that, because I was raised in a fundamentalist Christian church, and with very loving parents, very good parents. I just want to acknowledge them, but they were blind faith, and you know, long line of Protestants. They thought they were doing right by me, but for me personally, I was a very deep, sensitive child. So when they spoke about people burning in hell for eternity, that had a significant impact on my development. You know, it really morphed my relationship with reality and fear of being alive. And you know, I remember getting to the point of being able to admit that I don't believe in this God, but still believing that I was going to go to hell. You know, like that kind of paradigm of I don't believe in this, but the fear was so visceral that I was willing to go to hell for my beliefs, for my freedom. So I just want to acknowledge the beige there, and how many people, good intentions, enter these religious faiths, but you know, we really need to unpack that particularly, you know, all of us, but the child's mind, the developing mind, how precious that is to us, to create freedom of choice and freedom of critical thinking. And, you know, there's enough fear in this world to then add that to a developing mind. So thanks for mentioning that. Yeah.
Such a relevant thing to mention, Lani. I definitely resonate with absolutely everything you just said so strongly. And I could see Kayla just nodding her head, going, yes, yes, yes. And I think just another thing to add in terms of the intersection between family violence and some of the cultic behavior that I didn't mention is just the restriction to access to information. So controlling what information gets to the person. So that might be things like controlling like media access, like controlling books read, books owned, all of that kind of thing. So it's like technological, in addition to other forms of education and books, all of the above. So that's really critical as well, because especially for people born in a group who have never really had access to outside information, their entire view of reality is purely shaped on what that group has given them, the readings that group has given them, the knowledge that group has given them, the norms, the values, the beliefs. It has entirely been framed by that rather than any outside influence. So you can come to appreciate how leaving that and then coming into the outside world for people who are born into it, who are second generation members, would be extremely daunting, because you may be thinking that the outside world is dangerous, that something terrible will happen. Like Lani said, perhaps there's the threat of going to hell, the threat of damnation, the threat of something happening to humankind, and especially for children, an extremely heavy weight to carry. Yeah.
We'll just
So
be a little
yeah.
bit mindful of time, ladies. It's already 10 to 8, so we've got to keep.
Thanks, Lani. I think we've mentioned most of the things on this slide, but I will give us a little bit of a run through. So I mentioned that people might not always join cults because of crisis. It might be because they're seeking something. Some people might be going through change, transition, heightened states of vulnerability. Might look like things like divorce, might look like some kind of existential, even near-death experience. And for other people, it just might be a longing, like a longing to belong somewhere, to be with people, to connect with people. And I think especially in these times, probably even more so salient now. We're extremely isolated, very isolated after COVID. And I can only imagine, I think, the adolescents growing up in this time who have, gone through COVID, been isolated, and who have then gone on to join, terrorist organizations seeking, things like meaning and belonging and purpose. So these are the kinds of things that draw people. It's that I'm contributing to something, I'm given a purpose, I'm going to make meaning out of my life, I'm going to belong somewhere. And I think that is very likely one of the most attractive things, is connection to other people. And in terms of cults, sorry, Lani, I'll just go back for a second, thank you. In terms of how cults recruit, it can be really diverse. It can be through friends, through family, but also more and more now, I think we're seeing things like classes, activities. I'm not going to name anyone, but anyone who intends on going to the Mind Body Spirit Festival this weekend, I have no doubt that you will encounter a group that could probably fit this definition that you've seen tonight. And they will attend events like that and have stalls at events like the Mind Body Spirit Festival, who, people are going there, and there's a certain type of people that they're perhaps looking for, people who are open to perhaps things that are a little bit out of the ordinary or a different perspective, or again, people looking for that, seeking for that meaning. Yes, next slide. And cult leadership. I'll just read out this quote in the middle here. So narcissistic leaders are a significant and perhaps even a growing organizational challenge. Grandiose narcissists take outsized risks, they exploit others, overclaim credit for success, blame others for failure, ignore the advice of experts, and are overconfident in their abilities and judgment. When they succeed, we focus on their successes and ignore the failure. Narcissistic leaders are actually extremely prominent in corporate groups. In fact, they are often in positions of CEO, which is really interesting seeing that in the literature. But they're not always grandiose narcissists, I should say as well. They can sometimes, like Lani said, narcissism being a little bit more of a spectrum, everyone having some degree of sort of narcissism in them. It's sort of, I guess, serves a purpose to have some traits of narcissism, but it's a little bit more of a scale by all means. But cult leaders can definitely have traits of sociopathy, psychopathy, or very frequently authoritarian styles of leadership. They are extremely charismatic, very influential, and like I mentioned earlier, the ability to make people feel like they're special. Like, often people who are joining a cult might say that sometimes they've never felt truly seen or truly heard until they met that person, that cult leader that was enigmatic. They were, had that ability to make you feel so comfortable, like you could tell them anything. And like Lani mentioned earlier, sometimes that's exactly what they want you to do. They want you to tell them everything. They want you to provide information, because any transgressions that you might disclose can and may be used against you later, should you decide to do something that threatens that group. So it requires obedience, and they will punish those who go against what they say. And for a narcissist specifically, they have the ability to really feign empathy, to really sometimes give the impression that they're actually very empathetic, that they're very compassionate people. That's very hard for people to detect. I think something that is helpful to know is to look at whether it's transactional. So if you weren't to do what that person wanted you to do, what you thought they might expect you to do, what would happen? Would they still support you? Would they be there for you? Would there be judgment? Would there be blame? Would there be repercussions? I think that would be helpful. And they're exploitative. That the relationship is about getting what they want. So again, trying to detect whether, if I don't do what this person says, what will happen? And that will help you, I think, detect the exploitation that might be at play as well. And the leaders have a extreme sense of self-importance. Perhaps they believe that they are the person put on this earth to do this specific cause, or that they are putting forward a very important belief system or value system that's going to help a lot of people. And sometimes it is a worthy cause. Sometimes it is not a detrimental extreme ideology. That's something really important to keep in mind with cults, is that it's not necessarily this really outlandish idea that you look at and you go, oh, that's, that's really far-fetched. Sometimes you look at it and you're like, wow, no, that makes a lot of sense, or that genuinely provides a really important thing to society. And that's how people can kind of get involved with these groups as well, because you feel like you're contributing to something important. And last but not least, we just haven't covered that some of the things that can motivate cult leaders can be money, can be sex, but very often I think it is power. It's the ability to exercise power and influence large amounts of people, which I think then in turn feeds that sense of grandiosity, that sense of self-importance. Next slide.
Just before we move on, I mean, that quote there just speaks profoundly to me personally. So thank you, Violet, for putting that there. That is a very pivotal quote. And in August, me and Sandra from EPIC, which is an international psychedelic organization for ethics, we are going to be doing specific de-identified case studies for ethical situations. So I just wanted to highlight that, because what we're finding is that in the field of psychedelics is people actually do know that there's this kind of behavior happening, but are still, partnering and for business and for capitalism and all sorts of business arrangements are, I guess, choosing to engage with these leaders and leadership styles and organizations, even though that they're aware. So we're going to really be taking a deep dive into the ethics of being a professional in this space through the lens of different theoretical perspectives. And, because I think particularly in the field of psychedelics, people want these treatments into the mainstream for good reasons, to heal and for novel treatments, but at what cost? And, the means to the end. So yeah, watch this space for that webinar, as we will dive deeper into that.
That sounds extremely interesting, Lani. I very much look forward to that. And I think it's something that I think about quite a bit, is what do we do with this information when we know the signs and the indications of when people are engaging in highly coercive and controlling behaviors? And I'm going to speak to a bit of how the structure of policy can enable this sort of thing to happen. So I'm going to be speaking about psychedelics and cults, and I'm aware of the time, so I'll speak quickly. Just very quickly on what we mean by psychedelics. Typically, this refers to substances that act on the 5-HT2A receptor. These are things like psilocybin or magic mushrooms, LSD, DMT, ayahuasca. These are plants that have been consumed for thousands of years and are part of sacred ceremonies and traditional practice from all around the world. But what I'm going to be speaking about, what I refer to as psychedelics in this context, is the Western empirical research and medicalization model of clinical practice. And this also includes MDMA, which is I would argue not a psychedelic, but most people consider it psychedelic now in terms of our current landscape. In the 1950s, LSD therapy took hold around in the US and North America, Europe, and Australia as well, and was heralded, much as we hear today, as a revolution for mental illness. And it's really important to look at this time in history in relation to medical care as a whole. At that time, it was not long ago that penicillin had been discovered in the 1920s. I think that's an Australian discovery. And that had completely revolutionized medicine. And we entered into this era of drug discovery and pharmacological interventions that was very new and exciting. And at the same time, psychiatry was fighting for legitimacy. So we saw the sort of psychoanalytic Freudian psychotherapy replaced by a more biomedical model of psychiatry that was very eager to find its version of penicillin. So this is when LSD really has its moment, and a lot of researchers viewed this as the next big thing. And we hear that rhetoric again today. So where does cults and psychedelics have their intersection? In many places, I'd say. Both cults and psychedelics can induce very powerful subjective experiences through altered states of consciousness, as we referred to. This can happen through meditation, prayer, as well as through consuming a substance like a psychedelic. And psychedelics can increase feelings of belonging and connectedness, and something referred to as oceanic boundlessness, which is a term used in the measure of mystical experiences. And this sense of oceanic boundlessness is likely related to some of the effects psychedelics have on proprioception. They can distort the sense of where your body ends and the rest of the world begins. And this sense of connectedness or oneness is really a core feature of mystical experiences, whether induced by psychedelics or meditation or other means. In psychedelic-assisted therapy, the process of meaning making before, during, and after the psychedelic experience can be very greatly influenced by the environment and the people present. And this is commonly referred to as the set or the mindset that you go into it with, and the setting in which you consume that psychedelic. And the role of set and setting is really seen as the linchpin of the psychedelic experience and psychedelic assisted therapy. And in the clinical model that we see now today, we often see it described as really the only way for this to have a sort of utility or benefit for mental health is by really strictly adhering to rigid conditions around that set and setting. So very briefly, I'm going to mention drug policy and what is and isn't allowed now today. We had the first wave of clinical psychedelic use, as I mentioned, from the 1950s to 70s. And that effectively ended with the war on drugs, 1971. However, since about the early 2000s, in 2006, we had a slow recommencing of psychedelic studies after this sort of blackout period in psychedelic research. And this started to garner a lot of attention. And once again, much like in the 1950s, it started being labeled as a renaissance and new innovative cure for mental health conditions. Though I would point out that the research at this point is certainly far from conclusive on that. So now today, on February 3rd of this year, we had, much to everyone's surprise, I think, the Australian Therapeutic Goods Administration rescheduled psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression and MDMA for PTSD. And in all of the media reporting on this decision that hailed Australia as the first country to medicalize psychedelics, there was no mention of the fact that Australia had already had an era of psychedelic clinical use. And so I'm going to unpack a little bit about what happened during that time. So LSD was made illegal in '67, but a psychiatrist and researcher named Dr. Howard Whitaker advocated very strongly for clinicians to continue to have access to its medical use in Australia. He was based in Melbourne. And this was after the main manufacturer of LSD ended. So Whitaker actually convinced the state of Victoria to manufacture LSD for authorized prescribers and allow them to use them from about 1967 to 75. Whitaker was very widely respected and worked out of the New Haven Hospital and treated between 500 and 600 people with LSD with mixed results, only about half of them being beneficial. If you're interested in reading on this historic research, I'd recommend looking at the MAPS bibliography that you can find online. You can have access to a lot of really interesting historic research from that time, including Whitaker's. So psychiatrist Dr. Whitaker and other staff at the hospital he practiced at, the New Haven Hospital, started to see that their approach was only successful about 50% of the time. So Whitaker started looking in other directions, and he was introduced to a woman named Anne Hamilton Byrne through a metaphysicist named Raynor Johnson. And Johnson introduced Whitaker to Anne, who taught yoga and a holistic approach to healthcare. She considered the body and mind and spirit equally, and had a more holistic approach to her care. And Hamilton Byrne essentially started to execute an administrative takeover of the New Haven Psychiatric Hospital after convincing and getting Whitaker to come on board with her spiritual teachings. Many of the staff at the New Haven Hospital were converted to her spiritual teachings, and she herself became a director of the New Haven Hospital, and it became a recruiting ground for what was eventually known as the family, the cult she was involved in. So many of the staff became very strictly adherent to the practices. They were known as the aunties, and they managed to recruit a number of adults as well as children into this cult. Whitaker himself, the psychiatrist, used LSD, and Hamilton Byrne very much appreciated his access to LSD for the ability to give this to members and create a more pliable compliance with the cult practices. They used LSD in practices known as clearings, which involved administering LSD or psilocybin to new people as well as the existing members, and convinced the participants they could come to terms with their past and current psychological conflicts. Hamilton Byrne would actually use the LSD and obtain information about people during their dosing sessions, and then use this knowledge to create the impression that she had psychic powers afterwards. Whitaker himself, as I said, was a very well-respected psychiatrist at this time, but his record keeping and standards actually went against his own advice for the policies on LSD therapy in Australia. He was criticized for this. However, because he had such a strong standing in the community and was seen as the expert, there was no enforcement of on his practice. No one really was able to stop this. However, Whitaker left the cult in the early 70s. He no longer spoke about it. He seemed to kind of very quietly leave, and the cult practices were really only exposed from survivor accounts in the 1980s. And despite their accounts, there was never any justice or arrests made, despite overwhelming evidence of the abuses that took place. So the New Haven cult abuse was a largely structural regulatory system failure, and in part, and there's a fantastic master's thesis on this by someone named Megan Lomax, and she describes how, given the underlying ideological confusions in psychiatry, there was really no agreed mechanisms in the causes or treatments of mental health conditions, resulting in a sort of anything goes type of psychiatry that I'd argue that we still see to this day. We don't have clear understandings of why this works or what mechanisms are at play, which allows a sort of free for all in the type of practices that go on. And there are numerous contemporary examples of cult power dynamics in the current psychedelic therapy revival, as well as abusive practices and individual dynamics that go on. And so I want to emphasize that while psychedelic and MDMA therapy can be safe, it's extremely vital to understand the power of these substances, the increased suggestibility they bring about, and the interactions and power structures of abusive control that can happen with them. I'll pass on to Lani to speak about leaving cults, or any other comments on that.
Yeah, I guess just before we move on, just a huge passion I have is understanding the power of these substances and how good intentioned therapists, practitioners can get in all sorts of trouble because they're going through their own spiritual emergence or powerful consciousness spending practices themselves. And then they're entering these spaces with clients, may not have great leadership and elders around them, a lot of excitement, a lack of training, spiritual bypassing. Like there's a lot of elements that can go towards abuse and power and relational damage. And that's, I guess, a whole nother webinar we can do. But I just want to acknowledge that as well, that although the focus tonight is on cults and narcissistic leadership, this stuff can happen to any of us if we're not, being supervised, working with elders, really grounded in our practices, and aware of, touch protocols, consent, as Kayla's mentioned, and so many factors there to consider. So we'll just, we'll speak for another five or so minutes and open up to Q&A. So get your questions prepared. We'd love to really open this space and answer anything that we haven't covered, or unpack anything in more depth. But leaving a cult, so this is something I'm really passionate about creating awareness around, is that it is incredibly challenging for people to leave a cult. Often when they have a feeling that yes, it's time to leave, they've already experienced isolation, professional judgment, shame. Often it's a very isolating experience. They don't know where to go. They don't know who to connect with. Huge process of gaining their mind back. So, the gaslighting, the coercive control, reality can be very confusing. Also, a lot of health issues that occur during this time, sleep deprivation, mental health challenges, which then can be used against you to say that you're crazy. So people often don't believe you when you're talking, or, they do believe you and then they judge you for being so stupid to get involved in the cult in the first place. So there can be a huge range of feelings of paranoia, guilt, anger, betrayal, self-loathing. A lot of people have had, early childhood traumas, which can then be activated again. You think you've dealt with it, you think you're healed, you go into a cult or engage with a narcissistic leader in a very different context than your childhood. It might be corporate, it might be charity. And then all of a sudden, your developmental trauma is now ripped up, as well as your professional, identity as well. So just acknowledging the PTSD that can emerge from this, the existential fear, and the repercussions of leaving. Often people have to work really hard to rebuild their reputation. They often have to say sorry to people that they really shouldn't have to say sorry to. We should create a culture more of holding and understanding, and really the elders, particularly in the psychedelic space, I'm really hoping that can really identify vulnerable people in the community and identify professionals who may be involved in these spaces, and instead of cutting them out of work experiences or shaming them or engaging in splitting, because a big part of narcissistic abuse is they're brilliant at getting good people to split and to further have that control. And I would just really call leaders to not engage in splitting, and to hold that vibration of boundaries. I can't engage with you because of these reasons, but I'm here for you. Doors open when you're ready, and we'll get you support when you're ready. And that would make a massive difference for people leaving a cult. Anything else you want to add there, ladies, before I move on?
I think the point you make about shame is really important, and even using the word cult can be really difficult. And I know in my own case, with the Worldwide Church of God, labeling it a cult was a very difficult thing to do for a long time. And that word is so loaded. I call it the C word, the other C word. And it can be so hard to use that because nobody wants to admit that they were part of a cult, even, you know, in my case, it's growing up as a child in it. But I think, as you said, Lani, you recognize that even though that was my parents' choice, you know, they had a lot of really good intentions about being involved in that organization. So to put that sort of label that has such negative connotations and such shame of, you know, how could I have been caught up in this and be so foolish to get involved in this is really hard to do, in a similar way that it can be really, really challenging to label a relationship as abusive as well. It's hard to admit those things.
It'd be powerful to ask someone, what has your experience of reality been the last couple of years, and hear them and then reflect back. Is it safe for me to reflect what I've witnessed unfold and then come up with a shared language together? And yeah, I think, yeah. So leaving a cult, I really encourage everyone, if you are concerned about anyone, you know, just reflect on your own reactions and your own practices and what you can do to offer this space, harm reduction. And lastly, the whistleblower phenomena, really complex. Australia has some of the worst defamation laws in the world, so it's actually really dangerous for people to speak out. If you are a contractor, you can still be sued by your employer. Work cover may not cover you because you or Australian legislation, if you are a contractor, you've got more rights if you're a permanent or full-time employee of an organisation. But if you choose to speak out against your employer, particularly if you're a contractor, there's nothing stopping them from coming after you with a civil defamation case. And if they have a lot of money, they may have even made that known. There's many organisations that actually tell you that they will, you will be up for a defamation case if you speak out against them, non-disclosure agreements. And, you know, it's just a dangerous weapon for free speech. It's a dangerous weapon, particularly in the field of altered states and powerful psychedelics and capitalism, when you're not allowed to speak. And any organisation that has these practices, I really encourage you to look after yourself, to reflect and you know, to get out, because it's a real sign of information violence and a way of shutting down freedom of speech. So to be a whistleblower, you must have reasonable grounds to speak out, and the report must be made to either a senior representative of a company, a lawyer, or the whistleblower hotline, the Australian Security Investment Commission and the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, or the police. Even though we have some of these structures in place, I just want to acknowledge, because we are moving in next month to the International Day of the Whistleblower, most people that blow the whistle are prepared to lose it all. You know, most people that I've spoken to in this field, when they have chosen to speak out, it's because they were reclaiming their own dignity and their own ethics and their own existential sanity, knowing that they could lose their reputation, their house, their money. So I don't personally have a lot of huge faith in these systems to protect whistleblowers. I hope that we can see more and more legislative change and communities and structures and a culture of supporting whistleblowers. And what you find in the culture is, when whistleblowers speak out, often people are really grateful that they've busted open, you know, a cult or an organisation or a practice. But then they actually often don't want to work with them, or these people are seen as disruptors of the status quo, and it's not good for capitalism or the corporate vibe, or, you know, so thank you for doing that, but actually it's too contentious for me to engage with you. So yeah, just want to really acknowledge all those people around the world who have spoken out, have actually been further shamed or rejected by the community because it's uncomfortable. And yeah, so big thank you for all those people that have had the bravery to do so. And we will send these slides out. We've got a lot of questions for you to go through to consider if you are involved in a cult or an organizational structure that's abusive or narcissistic leadership. These questions will really help you. We have the Signs of Life has a blog piece that we're launching in the next couple of weeks that's been written by many people, including victim survivors of cults from around the world who've provided feedback, and also some screening tools as well to really help you drill down into, is this safe, and what is your context. So yeah, look forward to sharing those, and thanks ladies for being here tonight, your wisdom, your courage. And now is the time to ask any questions. You can just feel free to speak out or raise your hand or even put it in the text. We were hoping for some juicy discussion, so hopefully there's someone out there. Good, Adam.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. It was amazing. I do have a question around people who have narcissistic parts. How do you recommend or anything go about kind of integrating those parts and using them wisely and having harmony with those parts?
That's a massive question, but I love personally reading Thomas More. He's a psychotherapist, a depth psychology, deep connection to Jung, as well as written a pivotal book, The Dark Night of the Soul. But he was part of an international narcissist summit recently, and he quoted, "Narcissism is the very act of trying to find your soul." And when I heard that, it made me reflect on the narcissistic people that I have had contact with, or parts. They're desperately seeking attention, power, love, to be seen, to be heard, and do horrendous things to get that. But I think from a parts perspective is what can help people feel safe, seen, heard, valued, believed. And often narcissistic parts are deeply rooted in developmental trauma, mother-father culture. And I think internal family systems therapy, if the person has enough of a therapeutic window, it's often challenging. A lot of people with narcissism don't go to therapy, but the ones that do, that have enough insight, if you can bring that narcissism, that part, into the therapeutic room and see it, hold it, feel it, and Dan Brown's developmental psychology around trauma bonds and healing, that work is really pivotal as well, so they can get that sense of reparenting, that being seen. And I think it's very somatic as well as personality style. So there needs to be, the body needs to feel safe, learn to feel safe in this world again, in their own personality structure. Does anyone else want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I've just got something. Just wanted to say, great presentation, by the way. I was just wondering if you think there's such things as good cults. I mean, for myself, like I think I was in a cult, being a long-term rehab, called a therapeutic community, and I sort of saw it do more harm than good when I was in there. I'm a pretty stubborn person, so like they were trying to break me down to try and go with the flow of their whole program. But yeah, like I saw it do more harm than good with a lot of people. And while I was in the program, I called it a cult. And I had replies back to me that this is a good cult. Not all cults are bad. And now working in the drug and alcohol sector, like I see clients and stuff going to this sort of therapeutic community, and like I have all this worry and I warn people. But from being in there for 4 months, like I do still have this small amount of doubt in the back of my mind, thinking, am I in the wrong or am I in the right here? So yeah, I was just wondering if you think there are good cults at all.
Oh, good question. No, I don't, because I think cults by their very nature erode that sense of self and sense of freedom to be the self. So what I would love to see in psychedelic altars or psychedelic organizations is the power of multiplicity, the power of being able to hold diversity, the most diverse parts of the human psyche, the most diverse religions, and unite under that. And really the core of an organization or a psychedelic altar should be your relationship with the world, your relationship with reality.
Yeah.
And if that's not amplified in the message, then I would, I personally would be not okay with it.
I might just add to that quickly and just say that something I like to think of a lot, and it helps me stay away from like binary thinking of good and evil, which I used to really get stuck in a lot, to be honest. And that is to think not necessarily in terms of categorizing things as like, this is a cult, this is not a cult, or this is good, or this is evil. I find it helpful now because of the conflicting emotions that often come with these groups of like, this sense of, it's brought me this, but also it's taken this. And there's so much conflicting emotions, very similar to family violence. And so I find it really helpful to reflect on not whether something is good or bad or, those sort of binary thinking, but more on, does a person have an awareness, or does the group have an awareness of what they're doing? Has it been brought to their attention? Do they care? Have they made any effort to do anything differently? And if the answer is still that it involves exploitation, abuse, control, manipulation, then I think you have your answer.
Yeah, it's pretty much all of those.
Yeah. Lani, we do have someone who would like to ask a question, but they have asked if they can turn the recording off. And I've said that we can do that, but perhaps we'll leave the question until last.
And good idea. That's a great idea. Yeah. Just a comment on, how do we help narcissists? I think we have to also assess our level of risk, because what I've personally fallen into the trap of, I've got a huge bandwidth for terrible behavior, to be honest. I've huge compassion and have a big bandwidth for it. So you can get into a rescue mentality, is I can help this person with narcissism, I can help heal them, and compassion can be dangerous, actually, if you're in a risky territory and if you're in the thick of it. Compassion can come later as well. You can get out of that situation and then have a remote compassion for that person. There's other ways of having compassion. And I just think as therapists and wounded healers and people that want to heal, we've got to be careful, like, what is your existential, there's a book, Existential Kink, or what is your existential quirk there, where you think that you're the one to actually heal this person? Because actually you could just be being harmed by them profoundly, and you actually just need to run. So yeah, I think just be aware of your risk, and if you're the person to do that work, I think it's really pivotal. Yeah,
I think that's a really great one to bring up, and that came to mind as well for me when thinking about that, because coming from the lens of looking at this from intimate partner violence, family violence, the levels of risk that come along with having to recognize different aspects of gender-based violence and what power can lead to, essentially, of understanding the level of risk and understanding your own autonomy in that situation. And I think that relates to the other question as well, as I think always understanding how much autonomy you have in that dynamic, and how much freedom you have to seek your own safety and exist autonomously is extremely important. And that's a really difficult thing to assess, especially, I think that's where it's really useful speaking to other people and professionals as well, is understanding that level of risk, because that level of risk can be, extremely hard to look at when you're in it, in that dynamic with someone.
Yeah, and with coercive control, it can happen pretty rapidly. Your brain can
Absolutely
be within a couple of months or however long. So you can be really insightful, reflective, know what you're doing, and then dangerous. So any other questions before we turn off for the last private one? No. Beautiful. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. And we'll send out a lot of resources that we've been working on, and we really value any feedback as well, anything that we can do to update or improve the resources. A bit of community peer review would be much welcomed. And I just hope you can take away some of these red flags, these beige flags from tonight. Look after each other, look after our work cultures, look after the psychedelic space, and also, as I said, acknowledging there's narcissism in all of us in this culture, using that word carefully, but also feeling, that there is a community out there if you feel like you're being impacted by this, that will listen and take it serious and do what we can to help. So, thank you, and I'll turn this off and then we can ask the last question.